Bruno, look, the camera's there, look. Note.
5 things you wouldn't expect to go wrong at a Hyrox race. That's all through our own personal experience. Yes, YouTube, how are we all doing? Welcome to the latest video. Today we're going to be talking a lot of Hyrox, things that you need to avoid going into your next race. Getting straight into it, we're going to start with number 1.
Not going too hard on your first run. We are honestly criminal for this, and we've done it multiple times, and you'd think after doing 5 races now,
5
we'd
races.
learn our lesson, but it's honestly so important, and it has a massive impact on the rest of your race.
It's very easy to do that first run and think like, I feel amazing right now. You get onto that skier, you still equally feel just as good, because regardless of how fast you did that first run, your adrenaline is going to be absolutely pumping, so you won't feel that fatigue until you get, well, A, into the next run, but B, later on into the race. So it's something to really bear in mind.
So to put this in a bit of context, the first race we ever did was in Manchester, and our overall stats from the race, our average pace was a 5:05. It isn't bad at all, but when we actually broke it down and looked at the speed of our first run in comparison to the rest of them, our fastest run was a 4:08 and our slowest was a 5:32.
You're talking like a 1 minute 20 range, which is far too big. No matter how slow and fast your runs are, you should never be that much of a difference between your slowest and your fastest.
And the main reason why we had to run a 5:32 in the end was because we just blown ourselves out. Like, we had nothing left.
I've got nothing left. I've got nothing left.
So if you're running 10Ks at home, or you're doing track sessions and you've got like that comfortable pace you know you can stick to, that pace is only going to be achievable if you don't go too hard on that first run. It's basically like doing a 5-minute max effort sprint and then expecting yourself to hold on for another 50-60 minutes. It's hard. Second point to consider is language barriers in different countries. This might sound really obvious, but we did our first race in Katowice a couple of weeks ago. Obviously we've never been to Poland before, so it was an amazing experience going to a new country, but we didn't speak a word of Polish. So it was very difficult to understand the judges. Obviously we know the rules of Hyrox, we know what we should and shouldn't be doing, but when someone's speaking to you really fast in a different language and you start panicking thinking, well, I think I know what they're saying, but are they definitely saying that? It just throws you off completely for the whole race. To give you a great example, so Sherelle and I were on the sled pull, and as I was doing the first pull, I came back and my foot went onto the line. So immediately one of the judges came over and was speaking to me really fast in Polish, pointing at the line. Obviously, I knew what I'd done, and I could tell from his body language what I'd done too. So I was like, okay, he's giving me a warning, I've stood on the line. But then he also signalled over to the other side of the arena, the other judges, and was signalling hand movements, speaking again in Polish to me. So in my head I thought, well, I've had a warning, he must be giving me a penalty. Because you can't communicate, because you're already tired, because you're trying to concentrate on so many different things, my head just completely went, because I was like, well, has he given me a penalty? It really threw me off. It took me about 3 or 4 of the following runs to actually settle into it. Every time I was looking at the board, having a look to see, you know, have I got a penalty? Has this trip abroad been totally worth it? You've just got to be really mindful that things like that can happen, and it will affect your mindset in the race. It's nothing you can avoid. We're not saying to you need to learn the native language of the country you're going to, but it's just something to be aware of, that it can actually affect your mindset, which when you're doing a race like that, it's super hard to stay focused and forget about it.
Wall balls was a big cause of carnage for both of us, to be fair, in terms of like not knowing what reps you're on, because again, from a perspective of a language, and you're asking that judge how many reps I'm on, and they're trying to think what is 68 in English, but they've already now on 71, 72, and they're clicking. And something I think Hyrox need to do better at is making sure that all venues have the electronic board, because things like that won't happen and issues like that won't happen. But therefore count your own reps and just make sure you're paying attention to that. We had a big issue where I had squat cleaned the first rep, not in terms of a squat clean, just picking the ball up in the bottom of a squat, like still extension down, whatever. But I got no reps for that, and then what actually then ended up happening, because I did that, the judge then basically ruled off every other rep after that. So I just carried on grinding out reps when that person's shouting at me in Polish to stop, and I didn't really understand why. So again, issues with language barrier, so just always bear that in mind. Number 3 is that you need to make sure you're still counting your run laps regardless of what the board is telling you. Out of the 5 races that we've done, we've only had this issue once, but it's just something to bear in mind. In the last race that Sarah and I did together in the mixed doubles, I was getting very worried about the number on the board because it was basically not right with how many laps I knew we had to do. For example, I think it was particularly before the burpees, it was telling us that we'd only done 1 lap when I knew we were on our second. And then when we were coming in, it was saying that we'd only done 2 laps, and I was like, no, we literally need to go in the in now. So I knew that we had to. And then when we started doing burpees, I kind of obviously tiredly out of breath said to Sarah, I think the board's all wrong. And similar to what Sarah was saying before about stepping on the line and thinking she had a penalty, that was really playing on my head the whole time of the burpees. And then it wasn't until we started running again that it didn't say a penalty or anything like that. And the laps actually the next time round were back to how they should be. So it can happen. And I think what was happening was Sarah and I were drifting. We were too far away from one another, going over the chip timer. So for me looking at the board, it hadn't registered Sarah as well. So it was like the laps were a little bit confusing. So it's just make sure to stay close together probably.
4th thing to consider, which massively impacted my first race, probably you as well, is hydration and the dry mouth that you get from running laps in a hot building. One of the best pieces of advice that I can give anyone who's practicing with their Hyrox training is when you're doing your sim-like sessions or your big hard sessions, try and factor in how many times you're going to want to stop and have a drink or hydrate from the stations on the race, because if you can get used to going so far without having to stop and getting a drink, that's going to massively help you save time on the race day. A preventative measure is just making sure you're well hydrated beforehand. Electrolytes, if your race is in the morning and you obviously can't consume a hell of a lot of fluid, and just making sure you're hydrated up to the lead of the event as well. So the couple of days before is super, super important to make sure you're fully hydrated.
And the last one, number 5, is all to do with the rock zones. And this was something we had never appreciated before our first ever race. And when you're there calculating, okay, if I do 8K, I've got 8 stations, okay, what time can I kind of be aiming for? You don't regard the size of the rock zone and having such an influence on your time. You're looking at minimum 3.5 minutes, potentially up to 6, 7, depending on how you dominate the rock zones. It's going to add up to a lot of time in your day.
The rock zone is going to vary depending on how many laps equivalent you're going to be doing. So if you're going to be doing more laps, the surface area of the race track is smaller, so therefore the rock zone, the in and outs, is going to be smaller. Whereas if you've got a venue that's big, and probably a positive thing, you're not doing as many laps, maybe it's 1 or 2, the ins and outs are going to be a lot bigger, because to get to each station is going to be more spread out. So it's just something to consider as well. If you're setting yourself a target time, just bear in mind that there will be added on to that on the ins and outs. And no matter how hard you're struggling, make sure you're accountable to try and just run or jog out of the rock zones, because the more time you spend walking, the more time you spend just getting a drink, things like that, that clock is ticking. And that's the part of the race you'll look back and go, oh, I wish I just pushed a little bit harder there. If you are doing, say, a sim on your own, if you've got the setup to do it in your own gym, we've done it before. We've ran 1.2Ks just to equate for that time, because the amount of running you actually do between the stations, ins and out, it's going to add up. So if you've got the capacity to add on the extra 150, 200 meters, it will make a massive difference for your awareness of actually how long it's going to take you to complete the race. But there are 5 top tips or things we want you to be aware of. We hope you've liked this video. If you have, drop it a like, make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you in the next one.